But guys, listen. Firstly, I wanted to. I'm pleased. I hope you had a good Shabbos. I just also appreciate the extra time because at the end of the day, we've got this last daf to do in order to finish the first book, which is an amazing achievement that each of you have put in blood, sweat, and tears. And please God, we're almost there. All right. So what I'm going to do is thanks, man, I'm going to actually go through the Mishnah in a very simple way. I've thought of an easy way to give it over the previous one, and then just finish it so we can start the next one. So if Kev, you would like to indulge us and quickly read this?
Yes. Okay. The Mishnah contrasts a person's liability for damage that his ox does with his liability for damage that he himself does. There is a person who is liable for his ox's actions but is not liable for his own similar actions. And a person who is not liable for his ox's action but is liable for his own similar action. How so? If one's ox humiliated somebody, he is not liable. But if he himself humiliated somebody, he is liable. If one's ox blinded his Canaanite slave's eye or knocked out his tooth, he is not liable. But if he himself blinded his Canaanite slave's eye or knocked out his tooth, he is liable. By contrast, if one's ox wounded his father or his mother, he is liable to pay. But if he himself wounded his father or mother, he is not liable to pay. If one's ox set fire to a stack of grain on Shabbos, he is liable to pay. But if he himself set fire to a stack on Shabbos, he is not liable to pay, because he is liable to lose his life.
Okay. All right, so let's just do a summary quickly. Kevin asked a good question the other day. He said, what do you mean he's not liable if he wounds his parents or he breaks the Shabbos? Why is he not liable for financial payment? And that is because of the law of Kim Le B'di Rabba Minay, which means the lesser penalty or punishment is waived in favor of the greater penalty or punishment. A case in point is that when somebody is liable to two death penalties, we give the more stringent one because we cannot kill the person twice, and the more stringent one suffices to cover both the lesser stringent death penalty transgression as well as the greater sin, which implied the much more heavier death penalty. So too, financial payments are waived if one is going to lose their life in a capital offense, or if one is obligated to go to the city of exile or refuge, as it's known, for an accidental murder. So as far as that's concerned, there's very, very specific cases in which one is liable to the death penalty. The Ten Commandments gives us a great clue, by the way. If you covet your neighbor's wife and you commit adultery, that's a death penalty offense, or any other sexual act such as incest, etc., idol worship. It says honor thy mother and father. So the converse is if you abuse your mother and father to the degree that you strike them, at which you cause blood either externally or internally. We mean internally bruising, or externally that you actually create a bleeding wound. That's liable for the death penalty. And where is this found? If you look, Kevin, under Exodus, Shmot, chapter 1, verse 15, and you look at Rashi's explanation, it's clear. And Rashi even explains you're never liable for a payment for an act that brings the death penalty to bear upon him. So the death penalty for striking a parent, as Rashi explains, pertains if the blow inflicts a wound which bleeds either internally or externally, as I just explained Rashi. Where's this else is this mentioned? It's mentioned if we go into Bava Kamma 87a. It's also mentioned, Gavin and I learned this in Sanhedrin 85b. Do you remember, Gavin?
No, I have actually learned this.
Yeah, you have. You were part of us when you learned this. We also say if one curses their parents using the divine name, one gets the death penalty. If one curses one's parents, whether they're alive or dead. There's a whole discussion there whether you don't use the divine name, but that even can get the death penalty. Now, what else can get the death penalty? If you break Shabbat with warning and witnesses, etc., that's liable to the death penalty. Interesting enough, while we're on the subject of wounding, if you wound any Jew on purpose with warning, etc., on Shabbat, that's liable for the death penalty. I don't know if you guys know that.
I didn't actually hear what you said. I couldn't hear that word. What did you say?
If you wound, if you
wound.
If you don't kill, but you break somebody's jaw and they're pouring with blood on a Shabbos, you're liable to the death penalty. Okay? Just so you know.
Only on Shabbos.
Only on Shabbos. You'd have to kill them during the week in order to be liable for the death penalty, or accidentally kill them for the city of exile. But on Shabbos, it suffices to wound them. But not a minor.
So, Damon, what you doing tomorrow?
What?
What you doing tomorrow?
I don't understand the joke.
Well, I can't wound you on Shabbos, so what's you doing tomorrow?
Okay. So, guys, the reason why I want to discern a separateness about wounding a fellow Jew is I don't want you to confuse it with the case of wounding one's parents. So there's two major cases. Wounding one's parents gets the death penalty. Breaking Shabbos gets the death penalty. So, as far as that's concerned, we're going to start the Gemara share at this point. And what we are saying is very clearly that what constitutes breaking Shabbos where you get the death penalty is you have to basically, you've got Gezerah Shabbos and you've got Hekeshes. And Hekesh is where generally there are two pasuks, one after the other, and you make an inference. So how do we know the 39 prohibitions on Shabbat? It is, we look at the passage before in the Torah which states 39 creative activities at which one builds the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And those activities that were involved in the creative process of the Mishkan are the same ones that are prohibited on Shabbat. So therefore, if you do any destructive behavior on Shabbat without any positive purpose, it is, although it's forbidden rabbinically, it doesn't get the death penalty. It's not forbidden to Raisa. So for example, let's say, for example, you burn a fire in order to bake bread. Why are you doing that's cooking? So cooking you're prohibited to do because we bake the loaves that were involved in the temple and the tabernacle. Okay, but if you just burn something and there's no point, that doesn't warrant the death penalty. Okay, so a destructive act that has no positive end doesn't mimic the 39 productive, creative acts that were involved in building the Mishkan. Does that make sense, guys? So although it's rabbinically prohibited, it's not something where we suffer the death penalty. And this is according to Rav Abahu. But Rav Yochanan doesn't agree. So let me just read out from the Gemara. What I'm going to do, guys, is do my best to do it in 40 minutes. If not, we have to have a very small session. I know, Kev, you have to prepare for your students, so I'm not going to abuse your time. I know that. But I don't want this particular Mishnah to drag out. I want to have completed it. So tomorrow we do the new one, because if we do the new one, we're already on 35A1, and we need 1 week, which we have, in order to do 36A1, at which we finished the last daf. And we need all this time because we need a shir on Saturday night and a shir on Sunday, because on Sunday night is Yom Tov. So I appreciate your cooperation as far as this is concerned, but I'm not going to take advantage, Kevin. I know you're under pressure. So what it says in the Gemara brings an argument. It doesn't bring an argument in terms of any of the other things, because it's all obvious. But it says that it has a ruling concerning Shabbat, which is related to our Mishnah. Rav Abahu taught in a brisa before Rav Yochanan. All who do destructive acts on the Shabbat are exempt from punishment, except for one who inflicts a wound and who burns something. Okay. But Rav Yochanan objects to this teaching. So before we discuss why the exception of burning and wounding, basically Rav Yochanan says to Rav Abahu, go out and teach your brisa outside the study hall. I don't need to tell you that's a colloquial term for saying we don't accept your particular brisa as being a authentic brisa, which is why I asked him to go teach it outside. Now, what was his particular objection to this? Is he said that there is the ruling is that one who inflicts a wound or burns something destructively on the Shabbat isn't liable to punishment. Is liable to punishment is not a Tanaic teaching, for in fact the person is not liable. So this is the difference. Rav Abahu says as follows: is that listen, any destructive act that you do that is forbidden on the Shabbat is not liable to the death penalty, except for inflicting a wound or burning something. Rav Yochanan said, listen, there's no such thing. If you inflict a wound or you burn something, it's still a destructive act, and any destructive act that is caused on Shabbat is rabbinically prohibited, but it's not warranting of the death penalty. Does that make sense? So, Kevin, I was going to ask you, tell me the difference between those two arguments.
So between the
Rav Abahu and Rav Yochanan.
the difference.
Yes. You learned it the other morning when you did prep for the shir.
One's rabbinic. I don't know if I went over this. One's rabbinical and one's derisa.
No. What does Rav Yochanan say and what does Rav Abahu say and why?
I can't remember.
Okay. So that's why, guys, it's not Kevin's fault, is that I want to make sure that you guys know, because it's no good finishing the book if you don't know what's going on in the Gemara. And the thing of it is, what I'm saying is, Kevin, there are two different responses. So Rav Abahu starts off the Gemara and says, look, any destructive act done on Shabbat, you're not liable to the death penalty because it has no creative purpose except inflicting a wound, okay, and burning. Why inflicting a wound? Because there's a special rabbinic dispensation to allow for circumcision on the 8th day if it is on the Shabbat. And therefore, if you have a specific rabbinic dispensation allowing it, it must be that the default position is preventing it, meaning that it's not allowed. Does that make sense? And since it's not allowed, it's prohibited. Okay? And the same thing with regards to burning. The destructive act of burning is prohibited because there was a special dispensation, it would appear, that for regard to the daughter of a Kohen, and this is what I couldn't get clear from the Gemara, either we're not allowed to specifically give her the death penalty on a Shabbos, which is why the burning is prohibited biblically, or they allow for the death penalty to occur on a Shabbos because there's no delay, at which case there's a special dispensation to melt the lead in order to give her the death penalty. So either way, it's implying that for ordinary people, no matter which way you look at it, burning is specifically prohibited on Shabbos. Okay? And therefore he says, any destructive act that you do on Shabbos isn't worthy of the death penalty, except for inflicting a wound, because of this example of bris milah, which has a special dispensation, and burning, with the example of the bas Kohen getting a death penalty for adultery. So Rav Yochanan says, no, any destructive act with no purpose that's done on Shabbos is rabbinically prohibited, but is not biblically prohibited or worthy of the death penalty. Okay? And since this is the case, because why? I was thinking about it. Maybe Rav Yochanan is saying, listen, there's a rabbinic dispensation allowing it because it's rabbinically prohibited. It doesn't mean it's biblically prohibited. Does that make sense? So that might be where Rav Yochanan is coming from. So therefore, he disagrees with Rav Abahu that it is a legitimate brisa. But either way, now that we have two sides of the argument, we asking is that, hang on a second, we are saying here in the Mishna seems to contradict Rav Yochanan. Why does it contradict Rav Yochanan? because it's saying very clearly, okay? If you create, let me just see if I can share the Mishna. I've got this cat now wanting to play, which is extremely disconcerting. Just hang on a second. All right, so let me put it to you like this. Kevin, if you have a look at the Gemara, right? It says if you wound your father or mother, you're not liable to pay. Okay? If you set fire to a stack on Shabbat, you're not liable to pay. And why you're not liable to pay in both cases, Kevin?
There's a death penalty.
Correct. So this seems to contradict Rav Yochanan, because Rav Yochanan says, listen, there's no death penalty if you do a destructive act on the Shabbos. You're not allowed to, but there's no death penalty. But here, the Mishna is saying something else. He set fire to a stack on the Shabbat, and he doesn't pay, because he does get the death penalty. So this Mishna seems to be contradicting Rav Yochanan. Can you see that?
Can I give a quick example?
Okay.
Here's a packet of food. I tear it out. There's no writing. I'm opening it up. That's destructive. Yeah, I need to get to the food. Let's say here's the packet.
No, it's not the same example. Let me explain.
It's not the same.
Why. It's a great question. Kevin's asking a great question. Let me explain to you why it's not the same. I'm not tearing the packet of crisps for the sake of tearing the packet of crisps for no purpose. I'm trying to eat the packet of crisps. So I'm entitled to eat the packet of crisps. So Kevin's saying, then why, but you're doing a destructive act for the purpose of getting to the crisps, therefore you should get the death penalty for eating the crisps. And what I'm saying is there is an exception. You are allowed to cut food or do things on food that you're not allowed to do to other things. So for example, you can't cut a hose pipe, okay? But you can cut your steak. So anything that's deemed to be in the preparation of food or the eating of food has got an exemption on the status that you can do that to food itself. Otherwise, Kevin would be right. It's not a destructive act to break the packet because you're doing it in order to get to the crisps. And it would seem to imply the death penalty for doing a destructive act with a constructive purpose. But here the constructive purpose is the food, and why don't you get punished with a death penalty? Well, you don't get punished with a death penalty for the very sake is that it falls under the auspices of food, at which case you can tear food. So in order to get to the food, you've got a specific rabbinic dispensation to allow you to treat those barriers to food as though you were entering and eating food themselves. Excellent question. Okay, so you can see that the Mishnah seems to be contradicting Rav Yochanan. And what we are saying is here is that because it says, we learned in our Mishnah, if one's ox set fire to the stack on the Sabbath, he is liable to pay. But if he himself set fire to the stack on the Shabbat, he's not liable to pay because he's liable to lose his life. Now, by mentioning these two laws in context, the Mishnah teaches that the case involving himself is similar to the case involving his ox. So we may therefore deduce that just as an ox sets fire to a stack on the Shabbat, it does not need the ashes, so too in the case where he himself sets fire to the stack on Shabbos is one where he does not need the ashes either. So what we're saying is, look, an ox is dumb. It doesn't set fire to anything for a purpose. And the Mishnah is brilliant in that it would never make a parallel analogy. In other words, if man did something with a purpose and an ox did something without a purpose, the Mishnah would never put the two cases together. Why? Because they're not analogous. And since they're not analogous, there'd be no point. So here it's saying, listen, this is proof that man had no purpose, because just like an ox creates a fire with no purpose, so too in this particular case, the person did it with no purpose. Otherwise, there'd be no paralleling in the Mishnah. And therefore, it would seem contradictory to Rav Yochanan, because Rav Yochanan says there's no death penalty. In this case, it says man does get the death penalty. That's why he doesn't have to pay. You all hear the question, guys. We can move on. So fine. The Gemara responds, look, we are talking about something different. To the contrary, the Mishnah means that the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself, as follows. Just as in the case where he himself sets fire to the stack on Shabbat is where one needs the ashes, because otherwise he wouldn't be liable to the death penalty. So too the case in which his ox sets fire to the stack is when one in which the ox needs the ashes. So we're saying, no. The whole reason he gets a death penalty is he set the stack alight. The human being set the stack alight for a reason, the Jewish person. And therefore, that's why he's getting the death penalty. But then the Gemara is saying, but then the Mishnah must mean that the ox also set something alight. How can this be? An ox isn't smart. So the Gemara is saying, no. In this particular case, the ox set the stack alight in order to use its ashes because it had an itch on its back. And therefore, it wanted to use the ash as almost a remedy against the itching. So the response is, well, firstly, it's very unlikely that an ox would be that intelligent, so you need to prove it. So how do we prove it? How do you think we prove it, guys?
What, prove the ox?
Gavin, how do we prove that the ox, in fact, had an intelligence to set fire to the stack in order to get the ashes, in order to rub its back against, its wounded back against the ashes? In other words, to prove that the ox had a constructive purpose in setting fire to the stack. And therefore, that is analogous to man that set fire to the stack on purpose. And that's why he doesn't have to pay, because he gets the death penalty. Because we're saying, if you want to say that man did in fact set the stack alight for a constructive purpose, and that's why he doesn't have to pay, because it's constructive and therefore he's getting the death penalty, you must prove then that the ox is trying to do the same thing, because the cases in the Mishnah have to be parallel. So what evidence do we have, in fact, that the ox was intelligent enough to burn a stack of grain or hay, etc., in order to use the ashes to rectify an itch on its back?
There's no proof, in my opinion.
Okay.
Exactly.
So there is a proof, because what it's saying is exactly like Gavin and Kevin are saying, is that unless you see it, you mustn't believe it. So we're saying in this particular case in the Mishnah, this particular ox was seen as actually creating this fire, waiting for the ashes to cool down and rubbing a wound on its back. It was witnessed. So it was saying, okay, listen, okay, maybe if this is a unique ox in history, have we ever seen such a case? And the case is brought before Rav Papa, because Rav Papa was, there were people that witnessed Rav Papa's ox that had a toothache. And what happens is it lifted off a lid of a beer barrel in order to drink the beer and in fact find physical remedy and relief from its toothache. So everybody knew of this famous case by Rav Papa because he had one of the smartest oxes that there were. And he said, listen, is such a case possible in this sort of thing? You know what I'm saying? Because this was witnessed. And we're saying, okay, so even if it was witnessed, Gavin, that this was a lone ox in the Mishnah, why would you use an exceptional case to use as a parallel when most oxen are not that smart? And you're trying to have an analogy between a purposeful destructive act of an ox that the owner is required just to pay for the damages versus a purposeful destructive act of a human being at which he doesn't get to pay because he's liable to the death penalty. Because if it was destructive of no purpose, no death penalty. So, fine. So then obviously that case of Rav Papa is brought. And then what we are saying is, hang on a second. The rabbi said before Rav Papa, can you say that the Mishnah means that the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself? But the Mishnah teaches in its first clause, if one's ox humiliated someone, he is not liable. But if he himself humiliated someone, he is liable. If the case involving his ox is similar to the case involving himself, it must be one in which the ox intended to humiliate the victim. How can you ever find such a case? An ox certainly lacks the intelligence to intentionally humiliate someone. So what the rabbis are saying here to Rav Papa is, hang on a second, your ox might be an exception about the tooth remedy with the beer barrel, drinking the beer and lifting off the lid. But most oxen are stupid. And the proof of it is in the Mishnah itself. Because what does this Mishnah itself say, Gavin? Is that if your ox humiliates somebody, you don't have to pay for your ox humiliating anybody. Does that make sense? You don't have to pay. And if a Jew humiliates another Jew, that Jew has to pay. Okay? So we're saying that this is proving that an ox is not intelligent because the owner doesn't have to pay in such a case. And what is the response that the Gemara says? Look, in a case where the ox intended to injure the victim, and that is similar to the case concerning himself, for the master said in a braisa, as long as one intended to injure, he is liable for humiliation, even though he did not intend to humiliate. Okay, so Gavin, we learned in 27a in the Mishna. Remember about that falling guy? The guy that fell and then decided to fall in the right position on top of somebody and they got injured. And he has to pay for humiliation, or a case when somebody hits somebody in the bar, they intend to pay for humiliation. So we're saying, look, if ever there is intent to injure, that means that you have to pay humiliation. Because it's humiliating that one Jew is intentionally hurt by another Jew. It's embarrassing. So if you're in a fight and somebody hits you, it is so awkward and embarrassing, especially if your wife and children, God forbid, see such a thing. Are you with me? So we're saying an intention, even if the person just wanted to hit another person, but his intention wasn't to humiliate, it's absolutely embarrassing. And therefore we're saying that an ox doesn't have the intelligence to want to humiliate, and therefore he doesn't have to pay for that thing. But we're saying when an ox intends to injure, I suppose this is my question, and I've got a question on the Gemara. The question on the Gemara is that if a ox injures a person, you only have to pay for nezik shalom, actual damages. You don't have to pay for pain, medical expenses, convalescing, and humiliation. Okay? But if a human being hits another human being, you do, because his intent is to humiliate. My question on the Gemara originally was, hang on a second, when there's an act of keren, the definition of keren is the unusualness of the damage, but also the ox has an intention to injure or kill. Therefore, why doesn't he pay for humiliation? And the answer I thought about is the ox intends to injure, but it doesn't have man's capacity to weigh good versus evil. And therefore, man has to pay for humiliation simply because he's a higher developed neshama, soul. And therefore, his intention to want to injure somebody else comes with an adult penalty of paying for other damages, such as pain, medical expenses, convalescing, and humiliation. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
So then we're still left with an issue, and we're saying, fine, if the case is analogous, then where the only reason the person has the death penalty is in this case he set fire to the grain. In this case, he sets fire to the grain because he wants to use the ashes for something, and that's why he doesn't have to pay, because he gets the death penalty. And the ox in this case was intelligent because it set fire to something in order to, use the ashes for a wound. So fine. This would be a proof then, according to, that would technically support Rav Yochanan, meaning that it wasn't that burning and creating a wound is an exception at which that destructive act is prohibited on Shabbos. Rather, there was a purpose at which it was done, which supports Rav Yochanan. If you want to say you hold by Rav Abahu, then the reason why that death penalty is there is because even though it was a destructive act, it is biblically prohibited to burn something on Shabbos. So either way, you could see it supporting both opinions. But there is another resolution to this brisa, which is my favorite, and I'm just going to read it to you. Okay? And this to me makes the most amount of sense. Having concluded its discussion of the first resolution of the challenge to Rav Yochanan from our Mishnah, the Gemara offers another resolution. This resolution accepts the premise that the Mishnah means that the case involving the person himself burning a stack on the Shabbos is similar to the case involving his ox, and in a case in which he does not need the ashes. Nevertheless, the Mishnah exempts him from paying. It does not contradict Rav Yochanan's opinion that he's not liable to the death penalty for desecrating the Shabbos. So what it's saying is as follows. Listen, let's assume that he didn't need the ashes for anything. Okay? Then why is he getting that? Why does he not have to pay? All right, so let me put it to you like this. If we're saying that there wasn't a constructive act towards burning the ashes, it would seem to agree with Rav Abahu that says burning is prohibited and it gets the death penalty. We say that according to the second opinion, it could also state that it would support Rav Yochanan, even though Rav Yochanan said that there's no death penalty for burning on Shabbos with no constructive act. Why? And this is what we're getting to. Because there is a concept of kimlei b'dirabah minei for an act that has the potential to give the death penalty or the city of exile, even though it does not, in this case, get the death penalty or the city of exile. Let me just explain to you what I mean, guys. We learned in Sanhedrin, if somebody breaks into a house, a thief, and with that particular case, when he breaks into a house, he breaks the owner's barrel. He's not liable, Kevin, to pay for that owner's barrel. Why? Because by breaking into the house, he in fact is liable to get killed by the homeowner. In other words, he broke in the house, and anybody that sees somebody in their house is liable to kill the person out of sheer adrenaline and panic. So therefore, since that person could lose their life and they break something in that act, in that time period where they could lose their life, they don't have to pay for that particular damage for the very reason that their life is at risk. So even if the homeowner doesn't kill that thief, he has the potential to kill the thief, or the thief has the potential to lose their life at the hands of the homeowner. And since that is the case, he doesn't pay for any damages that's caused in that situation. Only if he takes the stolen item back home, where he's no longer in danger of his life, does he have to pay back that item. Does that make sense? So because we learned that in Sanhedrin, it's the potential for that which gives him a protection. Now, what I'm going to say is we've got... All right, Kev, I want to ask you a favor. At 9:30 tomorrow morning, when it hits 9:50, after 20 minutes, tell me then to cancel the recording, because the conversion time is very quick on 20 minutes, and it's not double on 40 minutes. It's like 4 times as much. Why? I have no idea. In theory, it's double, but it's not. It's like 4 times. So at 9:50, tell me to cancel and then reissue a 40-minute one. And we'll be done at 10:30 straight. All right, let's just do this in conclusion, guys. I really appreciate your help. All right. So having concluded its discussion of the first resolution of the challenge to Rav Yochanan from our Mishnah, the Gemara offers another resolution. This is my favorite resolution, guys. This resolution accepts the premise that the Mishnah means that the case involving the person himself burning a stack on Shabbat is similar to the case involving his ox, and in the case which he does not need the ashes. Nevertheless, when the Gemara exempts him from paying, it does not contradict Rav Yochanan's opinion that he is not liable to the death penalty for desecrating the Shabbat. Okay? So what are we saying here? There's a few things. Why is this my favorite? Well, very simply, is Gavin and you, Kevin, brought a good point last time. Is you're saying the probability of an ox being that intelligent is slim to none. And even if that ox is particularly intelligent, most are not. So how do you make an analogy based on an exception? You have to make an analogy based on the common, which is if an ox doesn't have the brains to burn something with a purpose, it's talking about a person that does a destructive act with no purpose, and therefore is not eligible to the death penalty according to Rav Yochanan. And when we say that he is not liable to pay, we don't understand why he's not liable to pay, because the only time you're not liable to pay is, in fact, when there's a death penalty that the person will get instead of paying, because the lesser amount is waived. What we're saying here is this is quite interesting, because with the potential of getting the death penalty, had it been on purpose, or had there been witnesses, or had there been a warning, in that particular case, a death penalty would have been enforced for burning on Shabbat. In other words, obviously, had there been a constructive act, and in any event, even if it had been a constructive act, we don't give the death penalty if there are no witnesses and warning. But the fact that the breaking of Shabbat has the potential for the death penalty is enough to exonerate the person owing money, because that potential is waived. Why? Because we discussed in Sanhedrin the fact that when a thief breaks in, he could lose his life at the hand of the homeowner, whose adrenaline, when he discovers the thief, is liable to do something crazy. And therefore, if he steals with his life at risk, then that thief is not liable for damages that he's done, but for the theft, yes, because when he takes that item back to his home, he's no longer in danger. But if he broke something accidentally while his life is in danger with the homeowner, he's not liable for that sort of breakage, because it's during the same time period where his life is at risk. Kim Labati Rabbamin, meaning the lesser penalty of damages is waived because his life is at risk. Okay. The only problem I had with that in Sanhedrin is I don't understand why we extend that courtesy to a thief, that he shouldn't make payment. But whatever, it is what it is. As far as one other thing is concerned, is that Rav Simcha Steinhauer gave me an answer while I was waiting for it to convert. He said there's no death penalty issued on Shabbat. Very interesting. There's no death penalty issued on Shabbat, which means the reason why you cannot wound, okay, or you cannot, is because if you wound on Shabbat where you draw blood, that alone is worthy of the death penalty. So you can't give a death penalty by beheading or stoning or anything like that on Shabbat, nor can you burn put hot lead down the bas Cohen, a daughter of a Cohen's throat, for committing adultery on Shabbat. So therefore burning is prohibited, and creating a wound is prohibited. And special dispensation when you're doing Brit Milah to allow for a wounding for a positive mitzvah. But a death penalty in this case, although it's a positive mitzvah to carry out a death penalty, it's not something we relish. It's not like a simcha. And we can delay it where it doesn't occur on Shabbat, because there's a myriad of complications. So therefore, Rav Abahu is saying that it's biblically prohibited, and Rav Yochanan said, well, it's rabbinically prohibited, but there's no constructive purpose. So bearing in mind this new explanation of resolution, we assume in our logic, the ox isn't very intelligent, that's why the owner doesn't pay for humiliation. When a person humiliates or intends to injure, the fact that he should know better than injuring another Jew makes him liable for payment, because he's a Jew, a thinking Jew that shouldn't hurt other Jews. And even if his intention isn't to humiliate, it's humiliating to injure another Jew. Therefore, he has to pay for humiliation, pay in medical expenses, convalescing, etc. Apart from there's actual damages. So, guys, do you like the second resolution better? It makes more sense to me. All right. Based on that fact, let's explore how it's actually given over in the Gemara. Rava said, our Mishna means that even if a person set fire to a stack unintentionally on Shabbat, he is exempt from paying. And its ruling is in accordance with the brisa taught in the Academy of Chizkiah. For it was taught in the Academy of Chizkiah, Scripture draws an analogy between one who kills a person and is thus executed and does not pay monetary damages, and one who kills an animal who does pay monetary damages. From this the following is distinguished. Okay, just as in the case of one who kills an animal, strikes an animal, you have to pay. It doesn't distinguish whether or not it's an inadvertent act or a deliberate act between an intentional act and an unintentional act, between a downward blow and an upward blow. Either way, if you do damage to an animal, you have to pay. Okay? What is determined by these sort of things, I suppose, is the extent of the damage. But when you damage man, we determine the difference between killing a man and damaging a man. A few things. Number one, it's different to an animal. Intent. Did you intend to kill the person? Did you unintentionally kill the person? The one gets the death penalty, the other one gets a lifetime in the city of exile. Okay? And did you intend to injure? Did you not intend to injure? And that also obviously has a bearing on certain costs, etc. Compared, is it an unavoidable accident? Was there negligence involved? These things make a difference when you're injuring man or killing man, but not when you kill or injure an animal. Then payment is due. So let me just give you a case in point here. Is that this is written in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 21. And one who strikes an animal, when it uses the term strikes in Sepharia, and in your stone chumash it says kills an animal, shall pay for it, and one who kills a person shall be put to death. Now, Gavin and I learned in Sanhedrin 79b, Kevin, the following. Okay? This is important. An inadvertent act is one in which the person did not intend to damage anything at all. Okay? So you inadvertently kill somebody. You didn't intend to, or you didn't intend to damage. An unintentional act is when the person intended to strike a different object, but struck this object in person or unintentionally. So what do we learn an example? We learned it a few dafs ago. You pick up a stone and you mean to smash through a glass bottle. And nobody in their right mind would hit a human temple in a person's head at that speed and strength because it would kill them. The intention absolutely was to smash the glass bottle, but not to hit a person. So when we call it inadvertent, that means you didn't intend to throw the stone at all. It might have, for example, we learned the daf that it's sitting on your lap, the stone. You forget that your coffee mug is on your lap. You get up after falling asleep and it kills somebody on the top of the head or it injures somebody. That's inadvertent, okay? Because you didn't even intend to do it. Then unintentional is different. You intended that force, but not to that particular person. That's the difference. What's the difference between a downward blow and an upward blow? Well, that's the difference about when you get to the city of refuge or not, or the city of exile, is one blow is determined to be an exonerating factor and one is a factor for conviction. Okay, but be that as it may, the bottom line we learn in Kevin is that if you kill an animal or you injure an animal, you just have to pay. If you kill a person, one loses their life. Or if it's unintentional but there's a death, city of exile, where you lose your quality of life for the rest of your life. Unless
you go with your family, just a random question. Do you go with your family? Do you have any idea about that? Or do you leave a family behind?
You leave your family behind. Okay.
Thank you.
Why? Mida keneged mida. You separated this person from his family. Why should you get to be with your family? Okay.
Yeah, no, I understand.
So, Gavin, this act, if you review do Chazorah and Sanhedrin 79b, that's where you'll find these discussions about how to discern between these various things. Okay? Now, so we exempt a person that kills another person from paying money in any of these cases. Rather, the verse means to obligate him to pay money in all these cases. So what are we saying here? Is we're saying, listen, when you kill an animal, we're not mentioning unintentional, intentional, inadvertent, purposeful, upward blow, downward blow in order to exempt payment if you kill an animal or you injure an animal. We're saying in all cases you are obligated for payment. The degree at which you pay is the degree of the damage. However, we are saying the same thing, is that when it deals with a person whom you kill, whether intentional, unintentional, whatever, the fact is you never pay money. It's an exemption where you never pay money. on the potential that a Jew could lose his life by committing that homicide, whether it's accidental or purposeful. In result, he never pays money. The fact that he has potential to get the death penalty. Okay? So, rather, you are to exempt him from paying money in all these cases. So just as in the case of homicide, the perpetrator is exempt from paying money, even in circumstances in which the death penalty is not imposed, so too in the case of Shabbat desecration, he is exempt from paying money, even when the death penalty is not imposed. And in our Mishna then, one who sets fire to a stack on Shabbat is exempt from paying for it, even though he does not need the ashes and is therefore not liable to the death penalty. So we're saying if he needed the ashes in a purposeful activity, he's definitely liable to the death penalty. But if he did not need the ashes, he still has the potential for the act of breaking Shabbos could get the death penalty, and that's enough to exempt him from payment, even though he doesn't get the death penalty. And it uses a similar example, is what happens if you burn something and there are not enough witnesses, there's not two witnesses but one. What if there wasn't a warning given? Or what if the warning didn't explain what sort of death penalty one gives for breaking Shabbos? He technically is eligible for the death penalty, but doesn't get it because of those exonerating factors, and therefore is exempt from any payment. Okay? Rava's explanation is challenged. The rabbi said to Rava, can you interpret the Mishnah as dealing with an inadvertent act? But it states the perpetrator is exempt from payment because he's punished with losing his life. So Rav explains, now this is a case that rabbis asked it to Rava, but Rav is giving an explanation to defend Rava. This is what the Mishnah means to say. Since in the case of a deliberate act of burning the stack on Shabbat, he's punished with losing his life. And in what circumstances does this pertain? Where he needs its ashes. Now, too, if his act was inadvertent, in other words, he didn't need the ashes, he's also exempt for payment. Okay? So in summary, one is liable to death for intentional homicide only if he kills deliberately and with intent for that specific victim. Okay, this is for creating murder, guys. One is liable to exile for inadvertent homicide only if he killed the victim with a downward motion, as it explains in Gemara Makos 7b, and that's derived from scriptural verse. Nevertheless, the Brisa derives through the analogy between striking a person and striking an animal that one who strikes a person and kills him, in all cases exempt from monetary payment or monetary compensation. This is Rashi. This is derived as follows. The phrase, one who strikes a person shall be put to death, implies that his only punishment is execution. He is not liable to pay. And the connected, and between the phrase, one who strikes an animal shall pay for it, and the phrase, one who strikes a person shall be put to death, teaches that just as there is no exceptions to the rule that one must pay for damages that he did in non-capital cases, in other words, if you injure somebody whether you plan to or not, so too there are no exceptions to the rule that he is exempt from paying for damages in capital cases. Regardless of whether the death penalty is imposed, the perpetrator is not required to pay monetary compensation for his act. This principle applies not only to cases of homicide, but to all capital cases, including Shabbos desecration, at which there's the death penalty. So Rashi describes this in Sanhedrin 79b, and so does Tosfot. So the Brisa means to employ this principle to exempt the perpetrator from monetary compensation for the life that he snuffed out, so that we can never think in a case of homicide he can pay off in order to get free of the death penalty, because you can never pay back a life you took, or for any other penalty. In other words, you can't pay money to get off going to the city of exile. And the same thing when you're committing a capital offense of breaking Shabbat, you can't pay by getting your way out of it. One loses their life if you do it on purpose, and so too, even if you do it inadvertently, you're exempt from paying.